My fellow citizens, my name is Joseph P. Firmage. I'm a candidate for President of the United States for 2024. This is a sensitive presentation regarding the state of current world affairs, about the challenges and opportunities when worldwide democracy faces the potential rise of an axis of conspiring totalitarians. Let's start with the situation in Ukraine. Any adequate contextualization of what's happening in that nation and involving NATO and Russia, the United States, and the whole world involves stepping back to World War II to properly set context for what's actually going on. The Second World War began in September of 1939 when Hitler and Stalin invaded Poland. The Soviet Union took most of Western Ukraine. Nazi Germany, with its allies, invaded the Soviet Union through that region 2 years later in 1941. Ukrainians fought on both sides, therefore, of the Second World War. By far the majority of ethnic Ukrainians, about 4.5 million, fought in the Red Army with the Russians for USSR against the Germans. Others joined the communist partisans, who included prominent commanders within the armies. Official data says that at least 8 million Ukrainians lost their lives, 5.5 to 6 million civilians, and more than 2.5 million natives of Ukraine were killed at the front. The data varies between 8 to 14 million people killed. However, only 6 million or so have been identified. Now, in December of 1991, many decades later, Ukraine gained full independence from the Soviet Union after the collapse of the USSR. The country changed its official name to Ukraine, and it helped to found the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, an association of countries that were formerly republics of the Soviet Union. In the 3 decades since the country became independent, the value of its natural resources and the pipelines that traverse Eurasia, Europe, Asia, for them have skyrocketed in value. Ukraine has extremely rich and complementary mineral resources in high concentrations and in close proximity to each other. The country has abundant reserves of coal, iron ore, natural gas, manganese, salt, oil, graphite, sulfur, titanium, nickel, and Ukraine's 3 operating uranium mines produced very significant quantities of uranium for each year of the past decade. All of Ukraine's uranium production is fabricated into nuclear fuel by TVEL of Russia and used in Ukraine's nuclear reactors. That is significant for the current utility of nuclear-powered grids on and in the future off Earth. Resulting from these facts, and from this particular analyst's educated perspective, I believe that President Putin's vision for Russia is to use every means necessary, short of nuclear exchange, but not short of acts of war, to actually reincorporate every CIS geographically strategic territory or nation necessary to command integrated and uninterruptible access to world trade, especially if those regions contain extremely valuable resources, and even more so if such can be employed by Russia to allow or constrict the flow of people and resources through key geographic and economic corridors around the world, to create a new USSR and split the future world here and potentially worlds above between itself and China, marginalizing the United States. The relatively slow but successful expansion of US-led NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, have yielded obviously the only Western Front allies that can and must be empowered to hold a common line of democracy. The very recent moves by the US and NATO in response to the invasion by Russia of Ukraine have been powerful indeed. Russia's eastern and southern fronts are comprised of China, Syria, Iran, and a few others, whose strategic zones are far more amenable to Russian permeability to remain viable, that is, for Russia to remain viable as a global power in a global economic environment. As resource limits of our planet force collaborations between adjacent nations, I believe that near-term goal scenarios, say 5 years or so out, will actually force Russia to increase its appetite for requiring all of the non-NATO former Soviet republics to be acquired by one means or another, and develop the highest strategic ties possible with at least one or two of three great powers. Russia will have to deal with China, with India, and or the United States, among others, of course. The US appears irreconcilably at war with Russia and China, doesn't it? Or does it? We have seen explicit evidence emerge in recent months and weeks of a strategic background of planning by China, Russia, and dependent states to challenge US global leadership. Net-net, President Putin, the individual, not Russia per se, wants peer status with the United States, or better, most of all, on Earth and beyond, and will use all unblocked means to do so. China is its most available strategic ally, despite some very large divergences of their current interests. President Xi Jinping is in fact a vastly more dangerous leader in my personal opinion, as he is genuinely a dictator by his nature, deriving power from inherited domestic benefit of a dramatic rise in productivity by duplication and advancement of largely Western and US science and technology. But China's centuries of internal civil wars devastated its populations through conquests and wars, and have been overcome by a productivity explosion in the past 2 decades that has given a righteous belief in the benefits of his autocracy. And we can understand, we must understand, that cultural perspective. Every great power's shared concerns are these: limited resources on Earth, and commanding those of the new frontier, space. Their common weapons: the claim that democracies cannot scale swiftly or act decisively by virtue of democracy's dependence upon legislative consensus. Thus, in hindsight, it is not surprising that they are acting upon that claim at a time when the world's leading democracy, the United States, appears disabled by internal political war. Thus, their common tactic of undercutting the stability of US economic and political infrastructure at a time of American discord within itself, especially when they both have played substantial roles in causing domestic political unrest in America. China's and Russia's use of all other means of undeclared war still comprise acts of war, including increasingly multi-layered cyber warfare, ransomware, political sabotage, and sharply rising space-based weaponry attacks, only some of which are known to the public yet. These tactics should be taken seriously as acts of war, at least to internally honest assessments. Specific ways to respond will be discussed in my next strategy brief concerning U.S. diplomatic and military priorities from my perspective. But their common mission is this: to acquire territory and resources by any means necessary. God and human rights, literally, be damned. So how do Russia, China, and others, such as North Korea, fit into the big picture? It is my assessment that China and Russia are now in de facto collaboration based upon the common denominator of aggressive nationalism, emerging from decades of internal chaos. In China's case, civil wars. In Russia's case, the collapse of the USSR structure over the past 30 years, and the necessity to rebuild both nations. It can build a sense of nationalism when it begins to work. North Korea remains a client state of China and can serve their shared interests at this time only to present a threatening distraction for our naval military posture in the Pacific. But I am deeply concerned that preparations may have been underway for a surprise attack on Taiwan at an opportune moment. North Korea may be preparing to distract our Pacific fleets with their intermediate range ballistic missiles, if given a word to do so, perhaps. I would not be surprised if the DPRK tested a nuclear device above the Pacific, not necessarily intending to destroy anything material, except U.S. self-confidence. From the reports from Council of Foreign Relations and World Economic Forum and other equally reputable global research enterprises, which I study routinely, these think tanks collectively believe that the escalation of developments between 2014 and 2021 have become what I call a hard resultant. Postures that have reached an extremely hard position, especially for President Putin. His goal is a new USSR, and can see no way at this late date to pause, recede, and relax tensions with its formerly integrated buffer states that are now nations, especially the geographically and historically central region and resource-rich Ukraine. These conditions are not as yet hardened in the case of China and Taiwan. But there is absolutely no question that successful violent incorporation of Ukraine into Russia would provide an immensely seductive window for China to move on Taiwan in a very similar and sudden military option. Therefore, I have tactical recommendations. I do recommend these actions be taken by the United States with fullest possible NATO allies' active and consistent support. First, require the suspension by Russia of additional military ground activity immediately. Second, propose a sequence of withdrawal of forces in concert with line item terms that can include non-aggression pacts with NATO. When fully withdrawn to agreed upon borders, re-acceptance of Russia into the G8 to reinvigorate a multilateral tourism industry between our nations, and ultimately step function increases in joint missions for climate restoration and space missions, perhaps even to colonize Mars. We can offer to negotiate a definitive schedule of these accommodations by the US-led NATO alliance within a defined period of time. And perhaps we could agree to offer Russia admittance to NATO at any time any other former USSR republic is offered admittance to NATO. We could offer it to Russia. We can genuinely offer to welcome Russia back into the democratic world that will inevitably be the future of all nations and the United Nations itself. We can give President Putin the opportunity to legitimately claim victory that his hard and disciplined posture has yielded a multilateral agreement that formally brings World War II to an end. Much of it started in Ukraine and Poland, my fellow citizens. That's where it should end too. We can allow President Putin to have a victory schedule that Russia has by expressing its great nation status, obtaining major accommodations from the West, including the strengthening of the G8 as an entity because Russia joins it again. And we can help them with their biggest goal, wealth and honor as a peer democracy in the eyes of the world. With this, we can end World War II and the Cold War. That would be a magnificent joint statement for this year ahead.
Interhologram.